the clicking, the cracking, the popping, the grinding, whatever it might be, isn't necessarily a structural problem, but it's actually a mechanical issue that you've developed over time without realizing it. G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how you can fix a shoulder that clicks and cracks or pops. Now, the important thing to understand about this video is that we're not necessarily going to link any of the structural issues to this type of symptom, because traditionally what we tend to see is that if someone's shoulder clicks, pops, or cracks, it's very easy for us to get a scan of that, potentially an x-ray, and then see that there's some form of arthritis in the area, and then automatically link those two things together. But what I want to promote in this video is I want to give you a couple of exercises that you can try to then quickly reassess how your shoulder feels, to see whether your dysfunction is actually mechanically related or whether there might be some deeper underlying issue that you might need to get checked out. At least in my experience as a physio, one of the things that I see a lot is that a lot of the clicking and cracking and popping in most people's shoulders is often a mechanical issue more than a structural issue. Now, there's some things that we're going to address throughout this video that are hopefully going to give you an understanding of what it is that's causing that, so that you can get to work on fixing that as soon as possible. The first thing that we need to talk about before we even get to these exercises is you need to understand why your shoulder might be clicking, cracking, and popping in the first place. And for what I find clinically, the overwhelming majority of people whose shoulders make noises is it often comes back to the position that your shoulder is in. Now, we know anatomically and functionally that your shoulder functions best when your shoulder blades are back, flat across your back, and your arm is orientated straight up and down. Now, what we tend to see with a lot of people is that because we live in a world now where sitting is so prominent, it's very easy for us to get sucked out of a good posture and kept here for long enough that our tissue becomes tight and restricted. So that when we get out of this posture and start moving around again, often that shoulder is left with some residual accrued dysfunction that can hamper the way that your shoulder functions and can set you up to click, to crack, or to pop when you use your shoulder. So the first thing that we need to make sure that you understand if we're trying to fix this is you need to analyze whether you're constantly in this shape, or even if you feel like you're up tall, but your shoulder is less straight up and down, your arm, sorry, is less straight up and down, or it is more anteriorly tilted. Because this anterior tilting fundamentally changes the way that you load your tissue so that when you start to move your arm and use your arm, it can set that tissue up to crack and click and pop, because mechanically it's being used in a way that it's not designed for. If you're not looking at your posture and getting a sense of where you're at, then long term it's very hard, if not impossible, to fix this, because we're not getting to the potential underlying original reason why your shoulder is popping, clicking, or cracking, or grinding in the first place. Now, the second thing we want to look after here is we want to have a test and a retest. So if you know what specific movement that you do or the particular activity that you do that generates that popping, clicking, cracking, or grinding, then it's important to do that exercise or that movement before you do each of these exercises, so we have something to compare it to afterwards. So that when you do an exercise, you can clearly see whether that exercise has benefited you, yes or no, and then you can decide whether it's a worthwhile thing to spend your time doing. So the first exercise that we want to get to here is potentially on the surface the most random. It often doesn't feel like it'll have as big of an impact as it ultimately does, which is why I want to do this one first. So the exercise we're basically going to do is we're going to take the ball and we're going to dig it into the upper regions of your back. But we often forget that the entire shoulder complex moves and is built upon your upper back and rib cage. And from these shapes and postures that we get into a lot, as soon as those arms and your shoulder girdle drop and roll forwards, we're often hanging through this part of the body. It's hanging off the base of your neck, it's hanging off the top of your upper back and rib cage, and ultimately this tissue can become tight and the joints underneath can become stiff. So if you're quite stiff and tight here and there's a handbrake here, number one, that can keep you in this sort of anteriorly tilted shoulder posture. But two, when you're moving your arm around, it can be another roadblock to normal function. So by taking that off, it gives us a much smoother path for your arm to move through, potentially decreasing the risk or the chances of getting those sound effects while doing it. So all I want you to do is to place the ball basically in between sort of the top of your back where the bump is in the middle and your shoulder blade. Somewhere in the middle there is perfectly fine. We're just going to maneuver the ball around to find a spot that feels a little bit stiff, tight, and tender. if you're right up against the bones down the middle of your spine, so not directly onto them, but just rolling off onto those, you'll be on the spinal joints. You come out a little bit wider, and this may be a little bit more tender for you as you go towards your shoulder blade, but this will be more towards the rib cage. And those rib joints, your intercostal muscles, the muscles over the top of the ribs, can become tight and stiff and restricted and can contribute to that shoulder clicking, cracking, or popping. What we can actually do is, again, find a spot that feels a little bit restricted, and then we can incorporate shoulder movement into this exercise. So ideally what should happen is you should have enough range of motion so that your arm, while it's straight, can contact the ground. Now for me, I feel a little bit tight and restricted here. So what I want to do is I want to get to the end of my range and just oscillate in and out of that range. And as I'm shearing free some of this tissue, what you'll hopefully see is that I very, very quickly start hitting the weight behind me, and I can now get to the ground, which I couldn't do comfortably before. So what I'm doing here is I'm using movement to shear free some of the restricted tissue, and again, hoping to feed some slack back into that shoulder. Again, I can move down a little bit further, go looking for the next area, and again, I feel a little bit restricted here. So that by doing this, I can then start to see that the arm goes further and further and further until I feel like I've freed that up enough that I've made a genuine difference. Now, as we said before, it's really important to do here is then to recheck your movements again, whichever they might be, just to see how you feel going forwards. One of the great things about that exercise with the ball and oscillating with the movement is that when I come back to this, it actually feels like my left side now moves a lot further than my right side does, because I've cleared a path for my arm and shoulder to move through, giving my shoulder the best chance to move normally or as normally as possible in the current climate, decreasing the risk that something's going to crack or click or pop in that shoulder. As we get to these next exercises, you might find that they have maybe a little bit more of a specific benefit depending on where your shoulder's clicking and cracking, but that's a really important one to master in the interim. Now, the next exercise that we want to go through, again, takes the ball, but we're looking to put the ball into the back of that shoulder. So for the same reason that we tend to put the ball up into the top of the upper back, when we do lose good shoulder posture, we tend to drop and roll forwards. So not only is this entire shoulder girdle hanging off the upper back and neck, but the arm itself is actually hanging off the shoulder blade. So what can tend to happen here is a lot of the muscular tissue at the back of that shoulder, whether it's your deltoid, whether it's your rotator cuff, it doesn't matter, but the tissue in that area can become tight as it tries to handle the weight of the arm consistently. And again, same thing as the upper back. As soon as we then try and move our arm around again with this really tight, close handbrake at the back of the shoulder, that might be causing some of the clicking at the tip of the shoulder or the front of the shoulder to occur. It's also one of the reasons why a lot of people tend to tilt that shoulder forwards. So by trying to free up this area, we can feed some slack back into the area, allow it to function more normally and to position itself in a more anatomically correct position. So again, with your ball, again, making sure that the ball that you choose is very comfortable for you. We literally want to place it at the back of that shoulder, essentially where the crease of your shoulder is at the back. And very, very quickly, if you tend to hug yourself, you might need to because it's quite tender, you'll feel that there'll be some things there that you may never have realized before. One of the things that I try and promote on this channel is we want to make sure that you're not just rolling around on the ball. I don't feel like that respects your nervous system enough. It's a very superficial way to release tissue. I don't think it gets the best results. What we can do here is that once you've found a spot that feels a little bit tight and a little bit tender, we can get you to tense up that tissue. So you can push your elbow down into the ground. You can try and tense all of your shoulder up. Making a fist does help. Get that tissue to tense up. And then what happens is after about 5 or 10 seconds, when you release that, you should feel like the ball is able to sink in a little bit deeper into that tissue. It feels a little bit less restricted. It might be a little bit less tender as well. So this cues your brain and nervous system into relaxing, getting that tissue to give and desensitizing the area. Now, the other thing that we can do here, once you've finished sort of hunting around, so you can go towards the back of the shoulder, you can come down a little bit more towards the back of the arm a little bit, and also a little bit further back towards the shoulder blade itself, and up and down from there, looking for what feels the most important for you. The other thing that we can do here is we can start to encourage movement by shearing this tissue free. So once I've found a spot that feels a little bit tight, in this rotated position, I can start to keep my elbow flat and just try and rotate my forearm down while keeping the same amount of pressure on the ball the whole way through, just to try and feed some slack into this area. So it's the same principle that we went through before when we were lifting our arms up and down, and it eventually went further. By finding a spot that feels a little bit tight and tender and restricted here, you can have your hand underneath your elbow if you do feel like it's more comfortable for you, and then just gently work through that restriction, paying close attention to how it feels. You want to be very respectful so your body feels comfortable releasing it. And then again, you can also come up into more of a shoulder flex position as well, rotate up into this position. You can turn your palm up and down here to really get some rotation in this overhead shape. And then what you should find again is when you're doing this, is you feel like it actually feels a little bit looser than it did before. And again, as you can see with my rotation here, my this side in particular is rotating a lot further because that was the side that I was releasing some of those handbrakes. So the next exercise that we want to touch on here revolves around the deepest part of the shoulder joint capsule. And why this is really important is, again, it feeds off the same principle that we went through with the upper back and rotator cuff or back of the shoulder exercises, in that as soon as we start to deviate away from a good posture and we're hanging off the tissue that attaches from our shoulder to our neck and upper back, the weight of that tissue can then ask those origins and insertions to become tight and stiff. So one of the things we realize is as this arm and shoulder girdle drops down, the upper back and neck can get stiff, but also the back of the shoulder can get tight as it's trying to support the weight of the arm. Now, deeper than that is the shoulder joint capsule. So if you would imagine that your shoulder is a ball and socket joint, which it is, if you were to wrap that in a thick layer of plastic wrap, that's essentially what your capsule is. And that's deeper to all the tissue of the shoulder, it's deeper to the rotator cuff. It basically encapsulates the joint. And again, if we're always in this sort of dropped and rotated down position, then that capsule, particularly at the back, can become stiffer than it needs to in response to those positions. So again, if we're looking to take away as many of those hidden handbrakes as possible, to feed some slack back into the shoulder, to decrease some of that clicking, cracking, popping, and grinding, gristling, whatever it is, we can't look past the deeper structure of your shoulder, which is the shoulder joint capsule. Now, there's a number of different ways to mobilize this. One of the best ways that I've seen to get the best results quickly is a very basic shoulder capsule stretch. Now, you can do this with a power band or a jump stretch band if you want to, but essentially what I'm going to get you to do here is we want to get you onto your hands and knees. Now, if this is uncomfortable for you, you can do this standing, leaning up on something. Choose the position that feels the most comfortable. But the idea of this particular stretch is we want you to imagine that your shoulder and your arm bone is pushing out the back corner or the back side of your shoulder blade, essentially where we dug the ball into a second ago. What we want to do here is making sure that your shoulders are back. So you want to drop your trunk past your shoulder blade so that they can sort of flatten as best as possible. And rotating the elbow pits forward, so the pointy bit's facing backwards, the sort of the concave parts facing forwards. Really rotate those arms around, so shoulders back, arms screwed in, so we've got a really stable shoulder joint here. All I want you to do is just gently shift your body weight across towards the side that you're trying to stretch, imagining and trying to get a feeling of that arm bone pushing out the back corner of that shoulder. And then what you should hopefully find here is, you should find there's a subtle pressure going on at the back of that shoulder. That's exactly what we're looking for. If you feel like this isn't quite powerful enough for you, what you can then do is take the elbows out of the equation. Again, shoulders back, hands sort of apart, and we can do the same thing again, where you're sort of scouring through that area, looking for where the best position is for you to feel that tightness. And again, what we can do here, the benefits of doing this position, is that we can change the orientation of your forearms to incorporate more external rotation or internal rotation to bias different parts of the back of that shoulder. So if you're in this position and then you rotate inwards and you feel like it pinches a little bit, then obviously you want to come out of that a little bit and try and find a comfortable version of that so that you can free that up and then come back to this position eventually. But also the same with external rotation. We want to try and find the positions that expose that tightness as best as possible. But that stretch in particular, that sort of shoulder capsule stretch, is easily one of the best shoulder mobility exercises that I've ever seen. And it's amazing at how much looser and freer your shoulder will feel afterwards, just by removing that deeper layer of restriction. So again, when you do your test, retest movements, pay close attention to how far you can move and how smooth that feels, as much as how that sort of clicking and cracking may feel. Now, the fourth thing that we need to touch on here is we need to go through a strength exercise to tie all this in together. Generally, in my experience, strength alone won't fix this because you can't out-strengthen stiffness. What we want to get you to do is remove that stiffness, get into better positions, and then make sure that you're supporting those better positions with better strength and better function. And a great way to do this is with some rowing type exercises. Now, again, if you've got a band or some cables, you can definitely do this in an upright position. The key to doing a really good bent over row or any particular rowing exercise, when you do this, just begin by bringing your elbow to your side and really forcing that shoulder blade to pull back towards the middle of your trunk. Again, we're not trying to rotate it all. We want to keep your trunk relatively still, but we want to do enough here that that elbow comes level with your trunk and it allows you to pull your shoulder blades back, strengthen some of the tissues at the back of your shoulder, strengthen some of the tissues that support your shoulder blade. So whether you're doing that bent over or whether you're doing that standing or in a rowing position, we ultimately want you to end up in a good posture. Now, if you feel like you can manage that really well, and you've taken off enough of those handbrakes that you don't feel like you're ending up in this position, then you will have a little bit more capacity to take the resistance closer to you. So essentially, when I'm in this position, if I can maintain a really good shoulder posture, there is no reason why I can't then enter into some shoulder extension and bring the resistance to my chest to finish off. The problem, again, that a lot of people fall into is they're just trying to bring the weight or the resistance close to them, and they're not paying attention to where that shoulder, the tip of the shoulder is going. So I can still pull my shoulder blade back in this position, but I'm also dumping forwards, which isn't great for any of the tissue that we're trying to respect with these exercises. So again, if you've got the mobility and the capacity to keep your shoulders back and not allow your shoulder to tilt into a bad shape. So again, I'm in a good position here and I'm just extending through my shoulder, not allowing the whole thing to tilt forwards on top of that. It's a subtle difference, but a really important one for anyone with any shoulder dysfunction to make sure that you're staying out of that shape to improve the way that you're loading that tissue to get the most out of these exercises going forward. So the fifth thing that I want to touch on with these exercises is once you've taken away some of the restrictions at the back, added some strength to the back, we also want to pay attention to what's happening at the front. Now, the reason why I've left this one till last is because in my experiences, a lot of chest tightness is actually a consequence of what's going on around the back. As I've discussed in a previous video, just stretching your chest muscles on their own isn't a path to loose the chest muscles long term, as strange as that sounds. Ultimately, we do need to release some of the accrued muscular tightness at the front, but if we're not taking out the stiffness through the rib cage at the back that these muscles anchor onto from the front, then our brain and nervous system are going to consistently cue those muscles into retightening again over and over again, irrespective of how well we're stretching these muscles. So what's important to do here is we want to make sure that you're taking care of the tissue at the back, getting it looser, getting it stronger, putting it into better positions, and then we want to layer on this pec muscle tightness, this pec stretch over the top to really help tie all this in together and hopefully get at any of those hidden restrictions at the front that might be changing the way you load your shoulder and contributing to those sound effects that we're trying so hard to get rid of. So whether you have a door frame or a strategically placed tree, I like to make sure that you start with your forearm up against the surface that you're on, and all you want to do here is up in a good posture. You want to rotate your trunk away until you find some tightness somewhere in your chest. You might need to lean forward a little bit or lean back a little bit just to really find the position that hits the tissue the best for you. What you can also do here is, if this isn't quite good enough, is you can reach up a little bit higher, extend your arm a little bit further, and then just play around with the position that you're in until you find the spot that really targets that tightness. And as we do for any of our muscular stretches, it's important to promote and remind you that a static stretch and just holding this position isn't good enough to make genuine change long term. The best and fastest way to make change with tight muscles is to do the proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitative technique, PNF for short, contract, relax. You've probably heard of it before. It doesn't matter what it's called. All you're really looking to do is to find a spot that feels really tight, stay here, and then tense that muscle that feels tight. So for me, I can feel some specific tightness right here. So I want to push my hand and my arm back into the tree. I want to tense up that muscle, get my brain and nervous system involved. I want to hold this for about 10 seconds, keep tensing. And then when I stop tensing and relax, so not coming out of the position, but I've tensed and I've relaxed in the same position, I should automatically then feel I can go a little bit further into the stretch than I could previously. And that version of a pec stretch needs to be very specific to you in terms of where your arm is and where your trunk needs to be. But by tensing that muscle up, relaxing it, and pushing further into the stretch, it cues your brain and nervous system into relaxing that tissue so much faster. And again, you should automatically feel like there's a big difference in terms of how loose one side feels to the next. And ultimately, we should hope to feel that upon your tests and retests, that some of that clicking, cracking, and popping has also reduced quite a bit. And again, ultimately, this is a conversation about trying to make sure that you're understanding the hidden cause of that popping and clicking and cracking. And also that even if you have been given a diagnosis of arthritis or wear and tear or something like that, degeneration potentially, that no one can tell you how much of your clicking, cracking, and popping is related to those things until you've wiped all this other stuff away and seen what's left over. Because in my experiences, the overwhelming majority of people whose shoulders click, crack, and pop have those hidden mechanical dysfunctions there beyond any of the structural stuff that they might see on a scan. Once again, I genuinely hope that was helpful. Please let me know down in the comments below how you went, which exercise you found was the most beneficial. But we'll see you in the next one.